Good evening. How are you? Very nice to see all of you again. And I'm very pleased that the room is almost full again. And thank you very much for coming to our event tonight. It's yet another event in our Krasno Events Series here at UNC-Chapel Hill. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in sunny Chapel Hill, I have to say. It really is sunny today. Today, our event is all about Germany, the crisis in Germany, the future of Angela Merkel, the future of German-American relations during the presidency of Donald Trump, and many other things which have to do with Germany, such as the refugee crisis and immigration problems and other issues that deal with Germany and Europe. The former German defense minister, Rudolf Scharping, unfortunately had to postpone his talk to October of this year because of the crisis in Germany. He was involved, or he is involved, in talking to people to get the SPD going again, so he couldn't come to see us, and I think that was a good enough reason, so I had to let him go. Before I introduce our speakers today, I would like to point out once again our fabulous website, krasnoevents.com. If you haven't seen it, please go onto it and look at it. And all our events are publicized there. You can have access to our YouTube channel there, youtube.com, Krasno UNC, and also see photos of our events which we have had recently, like the General Dempsey event, the event with Ambassador Matlock. The videos are up, and also the photos can be seen, and many of you will actually feature in these photos. And of course, if any one of you feels inclined to give us a generous amount of money so that we are able to continue running the series, then please don't hesitate to do so. Donations are always welcome. I know now people are looking away in an embarrassed way, but please, you don't have to. You can come forward and spend all your retirement money, please. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Dieter DETTKE today. Dieter DETTKE is the long-standing director of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in Washington, D.C. between 1985 and 2006. If you don't know what the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation is, let me briefly explain to you that that is a foundation run essentially by the Social Democratic Party in Germany. All political parties in Germany have the right to set up a foundation, which is something like a cultural institution and a think tank, really. And many of them, of course, act very actively inside Germany, but many of them, almost all of them, also have established offices abroad, particularly in capitals abroad, but not only, other regional capitals. And the SPD, their foundation is called the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, after a former German president in the 1920s. And let's say the Christian Democrats have their own foundation, that is the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. The Greens have the Heinrich Böll Foundation, after that famous writer. And the Liberals also have a foundation, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. But Dieter DETTKE, for over 20 years, was in charge of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in Washington, D.C. I met him when I held the Kissinger chair at the Library of Congress a number of years ago, and Dieter was so kind to invite me to an interview, not for an interview, but to an event on the Iraq war. And of course, I gladly accepted, and it was a great dinner, and we had a very lively discussion around the dinner table. I can tell you whether or not the invasion of Iraq made sense and was sensible or not. And it was a great pleasure to go to that event, and ever since, Dieter DETTKE and I have stayed in touch. And Dieter's actually written a book on the Iraq war. It is called Germany Says No, meaning Germany said no to participation in the Iraq war. And that is a book I can highly recommend to you. It is still available and still up to date in a way. So please consider that book as well. And Dieter DETTKE today teaches at Georgetown as an adjunct professor, and he also is a senior fellow at the AICGS, the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies in Washington, D.C. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Dieter DETTKE to us today. Then we have a discussant today, that is eminent UNC professor Konrad Jarausch. Konrad Jarausch is a historian of Germany, of Europe, of European civilization, and he is really a prolific writer. He has published and edited more than 40 books, and it seems that every year he is publishing yet another book, and it's very daunting for the rest of us. And his latest opus, and it really is an opus with over 800 pages, is Out of Ashes, a history of European history in the 20th century. It's a fascinating book, very readable, so again, I can recommend that book to you. If you don't have anything to do over the weekend, these two books should be on your reading list. In the following, Dieter will talk to us about the crisis in Germany. Then we will have a panel discussion here on stage. And then, of course, as often, and as almost really, we open it up to Q&A from you, the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Dieter DETTKE to the Krasno Events Series at UNC today.
Thank you very much, Klaus. That was so generous an introduction. Wonderful. I hope we can live up to it. But I want to thank Klaus for doing this here, and also I want to thank the Center for European Studies here at the University of North Carolina. As I mentioned here, we need European studies more than ever, and please keep it up. That's important to us and helpful in Europe. I know, of course, how prestigious the Krasno Events Series is, and Klaus has managed to get very important speakers here over time. That's really a great effort, and for me, this is no surprise because this is such a charming and idyllic place, Chapel Hill. I love to come here and leave Washington for a little bit, and this university has always attracted great minds. I see Professor Weinberg here, Professor Jarausch, and so this is no surprise that you get wonderful speakers here to this event. I think Klaus, I should mention that too, is also quite a prolific writer and an authority on European and German issues in particular. And coming from Washington, I would like to say we need this man more often in Washington to help us explain Europe, where we are a little bit under struggle right now to be recognized. And so Klaus, come to Washington and help us there. That's where we need you too. So, and also it's a great pleasure for me to be on the podium with Professor Jarausch. You mentioned him as an eminent historian of German unification, and of course a master of German history in general. So great pleasure to be here with him on the podium. Now, the subject tonight sounds a little complicated, but it is really timely. Just look at the Spiegel title from last week. It says, Die deutsche Krise, the German crisis. And then it speaks about a weakness of the people's parties, the large catch-all parties. And it also says and talks about the weak republic. And I think here Der Spiegel goes a little bit too far and is over the top to see Germany as a weak republic. The Berlin Republic, I have to say, is not Weimar. This Germany, this democracy that we have built over the years is not at risk. Yes, to the outside world, we appear a little bit confused and out of lack of leadership to some degree, but this is not the end of the world. It's a temporary weakness, and it is not there to stay. It could get worse, I have to admit that. But once the new Grand Coalition is in power and Merkel can govern on a regular basis, I think things will get better and we can move forward again in Germany and I think also in Europe. And that's more important than ever, to be able to move forward in Europe. So yesterday, some of you might have seen it, the CDU on a party congress decided to ratify the Grand Coalition Agreement to be in government again with the Social Democrats. The CSU, the sister party of the CDU in Bavaria, they did already sign on to the agreement on February 8th. So you were very quick to support it. The SPD has some difficulties. They're going to decide on March 4 on the basis of a membership referendum. And you have to know, the Grand Coalition as an institution is very controversial among SPD members, among the leadership too. And the reason is, of course, the bad electoral results last September. And a lot of people think and believe it is the Grand Coalition that led to these bad electoral results for the SPD. So the young socialists in Germany are on a campaign, a national campaign. You know, these are members of the Social Democratic Party, of course, the young socialists. But their president, Konrad, is on a real interesting campaign all over Germany to say no to the Grand Coalition, GroKo. It is known as GroKo. And that's quite effective. I still believe that this will turn out the right way because that's the only way for the SPD to go. You have to know, of course, that the bad electoral results are not necessarily the result of the Grand Coalition as an institution, but more so, I think, as a result of the refugee crisis. No doubt that the CDU, as well as the SPD, lost voters because that appeared to be too generous to take in over 1 million refugees just in 2015 and 16. That's pretty hard for Germany to do. And the repercussion inside the country was that the two big parties of the Grand Coalition, CDU, CSU, and SPD, really had to pay for it in terms of voter support. And the refugee crisis, I think, is also responsible for the current stalemate in forming a government. But I still believe the SPD has to renew itself as a party in government and not in opposition. A no vote, imagine, of the Social Democrats to the Grand Coalition agreement that has been written up would be a political disaster of grand proportion. The result would be a minority government of Chancellor Merkel. And in itself, I have to say, a minority government in Germany, which would be new for the first time, but it's not the end of the world. Because Chancellor Merkel, in that case, head of a minority government, could still get enough support from center parties on an ad hoc basis, and cobble together, whatever the needs and decisions are going to be in Europe. But I have to say that a minority government could indeed lead to a real instability in Germany, and not only as it is now, a perceived instability. Very important point. A long-term impact of a minority government could be real instability. Now, we have to know, of course, that Germany is still a very successful, solid democracy. The only thing is that the strong showing of the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, that right-wing party that came out of nowhere and has now over 90 seats in the Bundestag, and about 30% of the German voters support her. this AfD vote really struck the fear of compromise into the center parties. And that's what really happened. And that's at the core of the crisis in Germany. And we want to talk about this crisis here. And I think we have to know that it is the paralysis of the political center in Germany that's causing the crisis that we face now. So the alternatives being a minority government, I think that would lead to, more permanent instability. The other would be new elections. And I have to say, nobody in Germany after the September elections wanted new elections for one simple reason. Why would you expect that 3 months after the last elections, you would get a different result? And plus, the lack of capability to forge a government out of the center really would give the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, a real chance. And in that case, they might even grow if we would have new elections. So nobody wanted it. Merkel certainly would prefer a grand coalition over a minority government, even if she would be chancellor of it. But she would certainly prefer to govern in a grand coalition on a solid basis rather than this experiment as a minority government. So there was a lot of debate inside the SPD and the CDU too. CDU was not happy with another grand coalition, particularly because the new agreement, turned out to be rather problematic for the Christian Democrats too. They agreed to it yesterday and want to go for a grand coalition, for another grand coalition, but it came with great hesitation. But let me first talk about why a grand coalition is the least bad solution for the Social Democrats. And I say that on purpose, least bad. The strategic dilemma of the Social Democrats is, of course, that none of the signature issues of the party, and there are many, Bürgerversicherung, the public health insurance system that they want, the reduction of low-wage jobs, big problem right now on the labor market. We are doing fine, but there are too many low-wage jobs, and that needs to be changed. And then basic retirement income. That's something, too, that's close to the hearts of the Social Democrats. Or take government-provided childcare in kindergarten facilities, much needed in Germany now, with higher birth rates. And also, a new education initiative that the Social Democrats want, that would not, come to fruition if the SPD would be in opposition. Also, look at it this way. In opposition, the SPD would not have a chance and the prospect of coming to power anytime soon. It's impossible because, as a matter of principle, now every party, and the CDU decided in that direction yesterday, every party would exclude a coalition with the AfD. And you have to understand that's really important to do that in order to contain that new right-wing possibility in Germany. So nobody wants to coalesce with the AfD. The other point is Die Linke, with a share of about 10%, is also for the foreseeable future not in a position to join a national government. Their experience is in states, in Thüringen and in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. They were in Berlin, and in Berlin in power too, and on a local level. But their experience on the national level, that's lacking, and that's a different qualification that they need. And as long as they keep their anti-NATO, critical of Europe, and government spending is a big issue, they have to make adjustments in these three important areas in order to be able to coalesce and govern on a national level. So under these circumstances, then with 6 parties in the Bundestag now, a possibility of a red-green coalition that happened for Schröder in 1998, the last time, that is not going to work. That has no prospect to achieve a majority at the absolute number of seats in the Bundestag in order to form a government. So that option is certainly excluded. Some people dream of a red-green coalition, SPD, Die Linke, and the Green Party. And I can tell you, this is not going to happen, because you would need a judgment of Die Linke in particular, and don't count too much on the Greens to be only left of center. They push into the middle, and they want to be open for both sides. That's why they had this, Jamaica coalition experiment, and the Greens wanted to be in government. But to expect that, the possibility of a red-green coalition is simply not there. So that's not going to happen. Now, in opposition, one more point, and that's important. I think in opposition, the Social Democrats would run the risk of being pulled asunder by the temptation to go with Die Linke. And Oscar Lafontaine is already trying to do that. He suggests a new left-wing movement consisting of parts of the SPD, Die Linke, and parts of the Greens. I can tell you, this would lead to a destruction of the SPD, of the Social Democrats, as a party of left of center. It would be the end. And for the Social Democrats to agree to that concept of a new left-wing, more radical left movement, that would be, I think, almost an effort to commit suicide for the fear of death, and you shouldn't do that. So the other point is the Social Democrats are the strongest pillar now for Europe. And so it's important, from my perspective, that the Social Democrats should be in government. If they are in opposition and tempted to say no to European initiatives, think about it. It would practically take the heart and the soul out of the party because it's so much committed to Europe. And just for reasons of principle, of a principled opposition, to say no to European initiatives of a minority government by Merkel, that would also kill the party and kill it in an existential part. So in any case, the SPD is certainly in a difficult position right now because after the elections in September, they committed themselves under the leadership of Martin Schulz to be in the opposition rather than going for a new grand coalition. And that possibility to be in opposition is not a good perspective, and that's why I think it's important they have to go and support this new coalition agreement, and I'll talk about some of the content of the coalition agreement in a minute. I just wanted to say, since on the program also talks about Angela Merkel and her future, the CDU is, strategically speaking, in a better position than the Social Democrats right now. But Merkel's leadership is not uncontested. If you look around, her leadership is pretty much shaky, to put it mildly, and there's a need in the CDU too for new leadership. I think Merkel is a leader on her way out. The new government certainly gives her the 4th term of being chancellor, But I'm pretty sure she is not going to last all the way through the next less than 4 years as chancellor. I think she has to hand over power to new leaders in the, within the CDU-CSU. And there are already names being mentioned. One is Jens Spahn, interesting man. He lives in a same-sex marriage as a conservative man, and is certainly not, uncontroversial, but takes a very conservative position, is a Merkel critic on the refugee issue in particular. He has openly criticized the chancellor, and yet, he is very popular within CDU circles and, is mentioned as chancellor material. Another name, and watch out for that, it's called Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, hard to pronounce, and therefore use the term AKK. That's much easier, AKK. She has just been nominated General Secretary of the CDU, and that's a position, where chancellors come from in the CDU. So, Jens Spahn, I mentioned him in a minute, is going to Minister of Health in the new government, and you can tell, these two nominations in important position, cabinet positions too, tell you that Merkel is building them up to succeed. And that's a smart move to, make sure that there is a new leadership coming, and everybody expects, of course, this will be the last years of a Chancellor Merkel. I think three developments contributed to the decline of Merkel's power. One is the refugee crisis, the handling of it. Number two is the collapse of the Jamaica coalition, that first effort after the September elections last year to form a coalition between the CDU-CSU, the FDP, and the Greens. That would be a combination of the center-left and two center-right parties. That's really necessary if you want to have a majority now, that either the center-left or the center-right has to reach out to the other side in order to achieve enough seats in the Bundestag to form a government. And that failed. And it failed, as I mentioned, because of the paralysis there. They couldn't agree. The Jamaica coalition experiment couldn't agree on several issues. Migration was one important one. The budget, how much to spend and for what. European reform efforts. And these three issues, particularly controversial between the Greens and the conservative side. And they couldn't come to an agreement. And also, as perceived by the FDP in these coalition agreements for a so-called Jamaica coalition. You know why this is Jamaica? It's the flag, the colors of the flag of Jamaica, black, green, and yellow. Yeah, black, green, and yellow. So that's what you have now. You need to reach out either from the center right in Germany or from the center left. And the center as such is still quite strong. 70% of the people of the Germans support center parties, center left or center right. But for a majority in parliament, you need to reach out. There's an imperative to reach out to the other side by way of compromise. And that collapsed for the Jamaica coalition. And so the Grand Coalition is the only viable other solution. So when that failed, of course, Merkel's leadership was a little bit under pressure and still is. And the third issue is her weak performance in negotiating the current Grand Coalition agreement and how it's in substance, how it's structured, and the cabinet, the distribution of cabinet positions. That was also something that didn't go over well within CDU circles. because you know, the CDU appears to have the weaker position. The SPD gets the finance ministry, the foreign ministry, the Ministry of Labor, justice, and environment. These are key cabinet positions, right? The CSU gets a strong Ministry of the Interior, and they added a new department, which is called Heimat in German. So how, Professor Jarausch, how would you translate Heimat as a cabinet position?
Homeland.
Homeland? Not enough. No, it's more, you know, sentimental, much more sentimental than just homeland. This is very Bavarian too. Heimat. I mean, you know, this is. I would even say ground. I mean, you know, the attachment of people to their soil and ground. Anyway, I don't want to go too far, but you know, this new Ministry of the Interior is now much larger, and the head of the CSU, Horst Seehofer, will get that ministry. And the CSU will also get a new transportation ministry, very important, with the competence and in charge of digitalization, very important issue. And that's attached to the Ministry of Transport, and it will be controlled by the CSU. And they also get the Ministry for Development. So that leaves the CDU as the strongest party, sure, with the Chancellor's office. But with only 5 ministries, which is defense, very critical for Germany, if you look at it, what the German army looks like right now. Economics, that's an important one. Health, Jens Spahn. Education and agriculture. So, you know, that for many in the CDU looks like a weak agreement and a poor negotiating process in Merkel's hands. So her standing in the CDU is diminished, no doubt about it. The most dramatic leadership challenge, I think, was the refugee crisis, I already mentioned. Merkel did something that's very courageous, I have to say that, to take on, under crisis conditions, in Hungary in particular, not only the refugees that were sitting in Budapest, and Orban would not let them out. I mean, he kept them as hostages practically. And so Merkel stepping in and opening the doors to them in Germany, that was a courageous act. And Macron was the one who said, Merkel saved Europe's dignity. And he has a point. But Merkel had to pay dearly for it, because for Germany, this was almost overwhelming, I would say. And Merkel did not, you know, consult with the states, the German Länder, did not consult with mayors. And imagine, they were the ones, the states and the mayors and the local communities, who had to absorb these refugees. And they had to deal with the problems that arise. I mean, everything, you know, how to house them, education, and you name it. All these problems needed to be dealt with by the local communities. And Merkel didn't talk to them. And not to speak of the European partners about, you know, Germany letting them in, and somehow expected that other European states would help out, and they didn't. Viktor Orban was the most ferocious critic of Merkel's policy and saying, no refugees for us. Other Eastern European leaders did the same. So that was the challenge for Merkel, and now she is, of course, weaker. Weaker in Europe too, because not only Orban, who now says that the whole West is going to be going down. We have, you know, the chances for illiberalism are much better than for democracy. And he even predicted most recently that the whole West would fall apart and nations would go under because of taking in too many Islamic refugees. others too. Sebastian Kurz in Austria, who is now chancellor with, how old is he? 32, right? Young kid. In cahoots with the FPÖ, which is maybe a slightly lighter version than the AfD in Germany. And so, you know, there comes a lot of criticism too. And so we have to adjust policies in that respect in Europe too. So I have to say that the refugee crisis really changed the German political landscape. And also, I think it came to a point where the German identity appears to be at risk. And you know, that point has been made very precisely by the AfD, of course, that what we face is a threat to our own identity. And you know, the AfD thrived, and also Pegida, that's this organization that Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West, their name. And there are even more scary movements now. Reichsbürger, I don't know whether you heard that term, but they are real Nazis that are coming up, and they benefited from the refugee crisis. Now, the refugee crisis leads to a change of leadership, as I mentioned already, but also a change of policies, no doubt. The pressure is on within the CDU in particular and the CSU to go a more national course for Germany. And that has to be balanced against a greater need, from my perspective, to be more European. And that is a little bit under threat right now, if you look at the consequences of what we have seen in the context of the refugee crisis. Now, Klaus, let me just draw some conclusions now for Germany, Europe, and German-American relations from these issues. And first I want to say that the German crisis, since we want to talk about the crisis there, is the result of specific party issues that I discussed already. And it's also, I think, a result of more global trends that I see. All over Europe, you have seen that people's parties, these large catch-all parties, are in decline. Populism threatens the center-right and the center-left. And social democrats, of course, are hit more severely by these developments. Just look around. France, Socialist Party doesn't exist, hardly. I mean, you don't see very much of it, right? Macron now has a huge center party that occupies the most important space in France. Austria, Social Democrats hardly there. Netherlands, Spain. And so, you know, in elections, Social Democrats were hit most. And one part of the problem for Social Democrats is the weak leadership. Days of strong leadership in the CDU are over. We talked about this with Merkel. And in the SPD, that leadership crisis, in my view, is already going on for years and decades. You all remember Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, of course. These men were leaders larger than life. They were not only German leaders, they were European leaders, they were global leaders and had a lot to say on the global level. And I think that quality of leadership is sorely missing today. And then you had the Schulz disaster. The new president of the SPD was elected a year ago with 100% of support of the party congress, of the SPD party congress, and then ended up in a disaster and a political disaster leading to the worst electoral results in the history of social democracy in Germany. So the new leadership, Andrea Nahles is her name, is floor leader and the future party leader too. But I have to tell you, she needs time to assert her authority and to get the SPD, pull the SPD back from the brink of collapse. There's no doubt that this is necessary, and it will take time. And I hope she is going to be successful. But again, there is a larger process at work too that we have to recognize, and it is a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, you have this huge promise of a Pax Technica, it is called. The Facebook possibilities of a global community. Read the Zuckerberg manifesto, and then you have this design that we are a world community, right, through Facebook and social media. That is there on the one hand. But on the other hand, you also see, if you look around, and America is a good ground for experiments, you have an atomization of the society. Strongest individualism ever. And that is being nourished with the social media. So you have these two contradictory, almost contradictory results that political parties and every larger organization has to deal with. And you have, since we are all more or less pluralist societies, we have a degeneration of pluralism into tribalism in a very massive way. And that's an enormous challenge too. And here in the United States, as well as elsewhere in Europe too, politics are driven by polarization. And look at what happens to parties and organizations. You see a process of emancipation from large political organizations. And these organizations, parties, churches, trade unions, they have a hard time to catch up with this fast-moving new political environment and social media and all of that, and what it, the power that it puts into the hands of individuals. And for them, these fast movements and the elites of the parties, they appear to be slow catching up of what's going on. And so you have a harder time, a much more difficult time, to keep the society together and come up with a new glue. And the leadership for that, the ideas, how to keep societies together under these circumstances is sorely missing. Representation too, through political parties, is much more difficult and is confronted with a lack of support, lack of acceptance, lack of legitimacy, if you want, and not to speak of trust, the most important currency for democracies. So under the pressure from populism in particular, the willingness to compromise, and that's so necessary in a pluralistic society, the willingness to compromise is reduced, and that makes it difficult. And we know, of course, here in the United States in particular, that without tolerance and forbearance, you can't exist as a pluralistic society. You have to have these two strong elements, vibrant in our societies. And to speak about the consequences for Europe now, there it is particularly dangerous, in my view. For the first time in history, European integration moves backwards. We always thought that from crisis to crisis, Europe makes progress, gets more integration. That's Monnet credo, if you want to. That is different now. European integration can move backwards. So Brexit is clearly the tipping point that we saw in Europe. We now have an example of moving backward. But all we can hope for now is, I think, a Brexit agreement that would create a kind of new partnership with Britain. But by definition, Europe will be less integrated. There will be less integration and not more after Brexit and of what's happening with with the challenge of populism. If de Gaulle would still be alive, he would say, "I told you so," right? And you know, we have to know, of course, that Great Britain's attitude towards Europe was always a little more transactional than it was not. They were not in there with the heart. They were there with the brain, maybe, but not with their heart. And it took a lot of statecraft to bring Britain into Europe. If you remember, it was not only de Gaulle, there was hesitation on the British side too. And as a German, I have to say, you know, the fact that Germany is so economically important in Brussels and drives integration there, that contributes a lot to British insular inclinations and feelings. You know, there is a little bit of a fear of Germany involved in Brexit too. So let's face it, the refugee crisis and open borders to inner European migration led to this sense of loss of identity in Great Britain, as well as all over Europe and in the United States too. Trump in power, you know, that leads to a much stronger sense of nationalism, and that's catching fire everywhere, not only in this country. Whether it's going to stay, that's a different question. Let's hope it's temporary, but it is a challenge practically across the world. And the liberal world order that has been created by this country and the wise man in charge after World War II, that's now under threat from right here, from the creator of that liberal world order. And that's really confusing for people. And you know, this is an enormous challenge for Europe, because Europe needs the liberal world order more than the United States. The United States could exist without. Europe could not. That would be the breakdown of all, you know, sense of community in Europe. So the crucial issue for Europe is not only that, it's also the weakness of the EU in face of democratic backsliding. Look at Hungary, look at Poland, and you see that they clearly, you know, follow the Viktor Orban example. Poland and Hungary, they both joined the European Union on the basis of the Copenhagen criteria. Talk about democracy, human rights, markets, all these issues that are key in a liberal world order. And what we are now witnessing is an erosion of these values that empowered Poland and Hungary to join the European Union. And these are the values that lifted Eastern Europe out of poverty and out of dictatorship. So what you have now, they feel to be sovereign members of the European Union, and that sovereignty is now launched against the values of the expressed in the Copenhagen criteria. And that's, I think, a tragedy, that, you know, after they joining Europe, they begin to backslide and practically or do not take care of the values that enabled them to join the European Union. So, but I don't want to leave you just with my congenital pessimism, as you have noticed. One reason for optimism is the economy. Germany, growth is coming back, 2.2%. Unemployment is low compared to Europe, 3.6% at the end of 2017. Germany has a budget surplus of 36 billion euros and a 300 billion trade surplus. It's not only good, it's a threat for others, of course, but that's the situation. So what I'm saying is Germany is in rather good shape, and it shows that the worst of the crisis of 2008 and 9 is over. Europe is on the way back and on the way of recovery. And I think we also learned from mistakes made early on in 2008 and 9, which is early help is the best way of helping, and Germany hesitated too much to help Greece to get out of its own trouble. And then it cost Europe more than it would have if we had intervened earlier. So and we learned from that discussion. And now a few words about German-American relations, because it's my heart, it's my family, it's my own life, and it's my future too. So, and the coalition agreement that we have now for another great coalition talks about two important things: a new departure for Europe and a new dynamic for Germany, as it says. And every German expert knows Koalitionsvertrag and how important a treaty, a coalition agreement, really is for German politics. You know, the German, those who speak German of you know, Vertrag is Vertrag. You can rely on it. That's very important. It is a document that you have to stick to. And that's, you know, partly reassuring too, that you have something you can read, you can rely on, you can even go to court and implement it. It says two important things on transatlantic relations. One is, Europe has, and I quote, Europe has to become more independent and more capable to act. At the same time, we want to strengthen the ties to the United States. In short, we want to remain transatlantic and become more European, end of quote. That's the reassuring part. And then it talks a lot about improving European defense and you know, PESCO, the permanent structured cooperation in Europe. They talk about a European Council on Global Responsibility for Europe and other improvements of European defense. And they even speak about and that's important to get the terms right, an army of the Europeans, not a European army. There's a slight difference, right? And the difference is, of course, an army of the Europeans just pools existing military assets and forces. The European army would be an institution, right? And that would not go. But I think it's not bad that they take a more realistic approach to that issue. The NATO 2% goal that is so important for Trump. The Germans invented a new term. I have to give it to you. It is Zielkorridor. Professor Jarausch, please remember Zielkorridor and try to find out what it means. Target corridor? I don't know. Well, the point is 2% is not only 2%. It can be more, it can be less. There's a certain spread to it, and there's no real certain date. So that throws the whole concept open, of course, and I'm sure this will not go over well with the Trump administration. There are other issues too. Germans are crazy about nuclear weapons and how dangerous they are. They want to have disarmament. They want to reduce nuclear weapons. They want to remove the tactical nuclear weapons of the United States that are based in Europe. And that, again, is something where the two sides disagree. So there will be more controversy in our relationship as far as security is concerned. And then the United States also, and we have seen that at the Munich Security Conference that just took place 2 weeks ago. We have seen that the fear is rising in the Trump administration that what the Europeans are doing is not supporting NATO, they are creating an alternative to NATO. And I think that's an old discussion, and I don't think it's justified. I think what Europe does is good. It's good for Europe and it's good for NATO too. It's better to have, you know, these improvements on the European side rather than not. The German NATO commitment is strong. There's no doubt about it, also for deterrence and defense. And the other point that's a little more controversial, and that is about what to do about Russia. And the Grand Coalition Agreement says that NATO should also be ready for talks and consultations with Russia. There is this Russia-NATO consultation council, the NATO-Russia Council, and the Germans want to have that consultation process going again, and then they keep up the vision of a space, an economic space between Germany and Russia that includes the whole area between Lisbon and Vladivostok. That's a big concept, and I don't know how realistic, but that's the concept, and it means, you know, we have to work with Russia, which is not, by the way, totally different from Trump's inclinations vis-a-vis Russia, although for different reasons, I have to tell you that, so be a little careful in creating an identity of, in Russia, Western Russian relations with the Trump administration. There are other critical issues. I don't want to mention them all. Protectionism, I have to say that that's a big issue, and the agreement simply says protectionism is not the right way. And then it also says that transatlantic relations have to be based on values and interests, and that's clearly kind of admonition for the Trump administration in terms of keeping up the basic ideas of a liberal society. So, you know, there is challenge from, perceived challenge from the European side by the Trump administration, and it will be difficult in the next couple of years. The Europeans, the Grand Coalition says, we will respond to the Trump administration with more dialogue and cooperation. But to tell the truth, I think, you know, as long as Trump is in power, there will be more tensions than real fundamental cooperation. Not everything will go down the right. You know, America's civil society is too rich, and we are not going to give that up. Nobody wants to give that up to be in touch with American civil society. So, in spite of the collision potential that exists now, as long as Trump is in power, it's going to be a problem. But I have to tell you, and that's my last sentence, my deeper concern is that anti-Americanism will be stronger and survive Trump and be longer, a more permanent problem to deal with. That's my deeper concern. And on that optimistic note, thank you very much for your attention. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Shall we sit on this side?
Okay, yeah, sure.
Thank you very much. You certainly weren't too optimistic, were you? Would you sit in the middle, please?
Sure.
Even the light went dark.
Oh.
Because you were so pessimistic. Right. Thank you very much again. Can I just ask you a question before then passing on to Professor Jarausch? Considering that Germany had a very strong, almost dominant position in the last few years, now with the crisis and the weakening of Mrs. Merkel and Germany, shouldn't we all be glad that Germany is a bit weaker so that the other European states can breathe a little easier, that the French are coming into their own again and can shine a little bit more? So basically, isn't the German crisis a good thing for Europe?
No and hell no. Because you need a strong, stable Germany to keep Europe on an even keel. That's essential. I know German power creates a problem for Britain and for others, no doubt. The old joke is, of course, that every European wants the German army to be the size of Luxembourg, but bigger than the Soviet army, right?
It's actually a dog. And the front end towards the east is a German Shepherd, and the back end towards the west is a Dachshund.
Well, no, you have a serious point here. You can't, for example, you can't build up a defense of Europe of the European Union, and that's good for the United States too, because there is criticism of Europeans not doing enough, right? When they do more, then of course we get into the suspicion of creating something else that Americans don't want. We can balance that, I'm pretty sure. You have to build up potential first on the national level, and that includes Germany, before you can be stronger on an international level within NATO and within the European Union. Okay. And so that's why I would defend German strengths and just make sure that the Germans don't go overboard and elect the AfD in some way. So.
Okay, thanks very much. Professor Jarausch.
Yeah, I thank you very much for very content-rich presentation. I think in some ways it was the wrong audience, because you should have been talking to the younger members of the SPD in Germany, because it was a plea by explaining what all would go wrong if the Grand Coalition would not come about.
Right.
And so it's a little bit difficult for me to comment, because we agree on so many things. But you know academics, and they're going to talk anyway if they have the microphone. And so I have a couple of points that I want to make. First of all, it's a crisis for the Spiegel. And the Spiegel sells copies always by one crisis or another. And in German one says, which latest sow is being chased through the village. And the German crisis is die letzte Sau, die durchs Dorf gejagt wird. And my point would be, it's a German transition. That would be the correct term, because something is going on. And you indicated that the country in many ways is still strong. It won just 31 medals in the Winter Olympics, which, after Norway is number 2, and, it's way in front of the United States. And that's an embarrassment. Now, you choose for whom it's embarrassing. And, it won't, exist long. The economy is going, and the immigration pressure, even in my mind, is always a proof for the country's attractiveness, because you don't really want to immigrate into a country that you don't like. So, I think structurally underneath there, it's still okay. There are, however, 3 particular kinds of dimensions in which there is a problem. One of them is the election result. And I was expecting the word boredom, and I didn't hear it. And I think, in part, it is a media production, because they were bored with the Grand Coalition and with Merkel. Merkel is not good copy. She's not flamboyant, and the SPD tried to be a good copy. Gabriel, I hate to say it, seemed to me always like a German version of Sarkozy, which is the little Energizer bunny, that, always is doing something, then nothing ever gets done. Because he did not have any kind of straight line. He would jump like Seehofer from one side to another side over time, and that really hurt the SPD. So I think you have an election problem which has made it harder to create minorities because of a populist challenge both on the left with Die Linke and with the AfD on the right. And that is a little touch of Weimar, because there are now 2 of 6 parties which on the federal level are no longer capable of being in a government coalition. So one of the real challenges, which I don't hear from the German politicians or media, is to see whether or not these 2 parties cannot be transformed again and parliamentarized or whatever, because in Weimar, Stresemann's party was at the beginning also not really in favor of the government and so on, of the system, and then, eventually it came in. And political leadership sometimes is not just to push people out, but is also to try to transform them, to make them part of the system. Because as long as those 2 of the 6 are out, the rest is 4, and then it's either Grand Coalition or Jamaica, you know, and that's kind of stalemating a political system, okay? And so the question is, how do you get beyond that? Another dimension of problems is Angela Merkel, because I catch something of a whiff of what in German is called Endzeitstimmung. That is a kind of mood, and I don't think it's only the media, but it is also, I think, in the population. People like Merkel, they appreciate her, they are grateful for her leadership and so on, and that's where I'm back at boredom, you know, but it's like, you know, Mutti Deutschland or whatever. It's been there, and there's a generational, you know, aspect which, you know, I didn't hear either. You know, that is, you talked about younger leaders in other countries and so on, but these younger leaders in Germany also are impatient. They want to be able to do it themselves. And you have a kind of a paradox or an ambivalence with that, because you have somebody who is highly experienced, but then so was Adenauer and so was Kohl. You know, and Willy Brandt, of course, you know, took a dive before he should have. You know, Helmut Schmidt kind of tried to hang on for a while. These transitions, that's why I talked about transition before, are never easy. And there is, I think, a generational transition which is about to happen. And Angela Merkel has actually made it more difficult, because she had gotten rid of an entire generation of CDU political leadership, some of whom are crawling back out from under the rocks right now, like Merz or whatever, or Koch, and so on, you know, because the other ones are on the state level, either that or they have been in ministries like de Maizière or von der Leyen, you know, in which they have ruined their reputations. And you get somebody, the Ministry of Defense in Germany, that means you want to kill that political career, you know, and it's worked so far pretty well for everybody.
Thank you very much. Can I you've got one more point here?
You know, and I think, you know, I would like to put it into slightly more historical perspective instead of just, you know, current politics. There is, I think you mentioned that quite correctly, the erosion of the large parties. The SPD did Agenda 2010, okay, and it ruined its working class base. It took one for the country. And, you know, what I'm sorry about in the SPD is that they are backing away from it, that they're not trying to get across to the workers that, you know, if the economy is not good, your wages are not going up, and so on, okay? But it's rather the old kind of clientelism. We need money in order to spread around to people whom we are going to make kindly disposed towards us by giving them presents and stuff. And the CDU has done the same thing with immigration. It also took one for the country. And it is also creating enormous pressures within the CDU. And Merkel has moved the CDU into the center and even into the center left, and has kind of taken the air away for the SPD to exist.
Thanks.
And, you know, part of the transition is, you know, recalibrating these dimensions, because as long as they are not fixed, you know, whatever, you know, parliamentary solution we have is short run, because in the next 4 years this transition is going to have to happen.
Okay, thanks very much. So you say a transition, no real crisis, you know, it will all be resolved in due course. You say, or you told us, there's a big crisis. So who is right?
We're both right.
Oh, right. You were not a diplomat in your previous life, were you?
But I want to say, I want to take up the term transition. It's important. The big question is transition to what? So what's going to happen? You talked about the Austrian pattern, which is Kurz and FPÖ. And you also talked about the parliamentarization of Die Linke and the AfD, I would guess. And that's a very important point. The question is whether it's really enough for Germany, as we do right now, to simply block these two out of anything, out of the political process, keep them outside, and don't include them into responsibility, hoping that would mainstream them. That's the big issue. Can we do that? Can Germany, with her history, try to mainstream the AfD? And I tell you, it's going to be a hell of a job to do that. Yes, I understand, the AfD is not the same as the NSDAP. There are other people who would represent that more. But, the essential part of transition is, of course, they have to transition to more democracy. That's what I would like to see. And I see a better chance of Die Linke to transition. I would say in Die Linke, it's a generational issue. Once Oskar Lafontaine is gone, then, the SPD would be in a better position to parliamentarize Die Linke. They're already, there's a Linke minister president in Thüringen. They are mayors, and some of them do a good job. Like the Italian Communist Party, they also did a good job on the local level. Let them do it, and let them, change and transition into the right direction. That's what I would say. You have a good point using that term. And if I may, what really irked me when you were speaking was you said the SPD destroyed the workers' basis of the party. And that's a little bit too harsh for me, because of a trend that you could observe for many, many years already, that indeed the class-based worker basis of the Social Democrats has been going and has been melting away a long, long time.
But
and the SPD, let me just make that point, and then I want to hear you. The SPD is de facto a middle class party, and the heart of the SPD is middle class already. Workers are middle class now. Workers are not the suppressed underclass. They are middle class now, and that's important to incorporate and not to lose. And what Schröder did, and I think you referred to him when you talked about this destruction of the workers' base for the SPD. That was, I think, courageous. I think it was necessary. It saved Germany from going under economically in many ways and being eaten up by our own welfare system, and Schröder did it. It was courageous. He lost his job, but I tell you one thing, we need leaders like him. And we should recognize the reason why Germany is doing well economically right now is because of Schröder and his reforms. Kohl didn't touch it, Merkel didn't touch it, Schröder did, and he lost. Yes, I agree. But it's not the destruction of the workers by Schröder or by the SPD itself. That's a longer process. And yes, I regret that today, last sentence, the AfD has a greater share of workers than the Social Democrats. Well, that breaks my heart.
But that proves my point. No, I mean...
No. Wait a minute. The point you wanted to make was that the SPD destroyed it.
No, it didn't destroy.
That goes too far.
It lost a good part of its prior social structure by becoming an Angestelltenpartei, okay? And this tension between blue collar and white collar, the party needs to be able to tolerate and turn constructively, because if it goes only to the white collar people, which is where some of it is going, then it leaves a bunch of the blue collar people out there to be picked up by people like the AfD.
Okay.
Well, Konrad, but the SPD is never going to go and come to power just on the basis as a worker party, because
that's not what I said. I said workers and white-collar employees together. Okay, one alone is not going to do it.
Right. Let me move away to a different point. If the Grand Coalition, the new Grand Coalition, is not going to happen, one never knows, or if it collapses soon after a year or two, what is wrong with a minority government? It is possible in other countries, and also what is wrong with new elections. Sometimes, as we know from other countries, you have to give the electorate another chance. That 3 or 4 months is a long time to reconsider their vote. They may now vote differently in all sorts of ways. Regarding Brexit, many of us say we need a second referendum urgently. So regarding the German elections, why don't we need a second German federal election urgently?
You can't do that and go back to the people and tell them you voted the wrong way, now vote again until you do it right. That's not...
You don't have to put it like that.
You don't do that. But more seriously, there's nothing wrong in principle with a minority government. All I'm saying is that the perceived instability right now over, government building will transition, to use your term, into a real instability if we have a minority government, because that would be, Merkel jumping from one issue to the other and from one majority to another, and that's not a healthy system. Then it's probably better to have new elections. And I say there's nothing wrong with new elections either, but you can't have it every 4 weeks or so. You can't do that.
It's already taken long enough now, and if the Grand Coalition should fail, a minority government might be a time-limited caretaker. You could say, give it another 6 months and have another set of elections in the following fall.
Yeah.
That's, I think, entirely doable.
Yeah. Well, it's doable, but it's bad for Europe, because you have to make decisions on Europe. And not a stable government in Germany is going to hinder progress on Europe.
Well, it's going to create a duck that is lamer than should be.
Thank you very much. I think we need to open it up to questions from the audience. Of course, both our speakers can respond. Yes, please. Can you wait for the microphone?
Yeah.
After Macron won his election, he proposed a very ambitious program with regard to the EU. I'm curious about, what does the Grand Coalition program say about President Macron's ideas?
Yes, very good question. The SPD is very much in support of Macron's European initiative. For the CDU, it goes too far in many ways, and the danger zone, so to speak, in the Eurozone reform is whenever it tilts over into a money machine for German accounts and a credit card for German accounts. That's what the Germans fear, that to open up the risk too far of, they call it moral risk now, the financial people, moral risk. Knowing that you will be bailed out, it encourages bad behavior, right? So you want to avoid that. But some of these reforms, the Macron reforms, are very good in my view. Eurozone finance minister would be good. A Eurozone budget is helpful, would be good. And that might come. The coalition agreement supports the Macron's idea of a European monetary system, like the, how is it, IWF, EWF in German, IMF, International Monetary Fund. That's what they want, and increase, the help in terms of a financial crisis for for members of the European Union, right? Okay. And that is in support, and I think it's great. We need a support and a strengthening of Eurozone institutions in order to make it stick, in order to make it more effective, and I think we're on the right course there. Macron is not going to go get everything, but the particularly the SPD is pushing for, part of the Macron reforms.
Okay, thanks very much. We need to get some other questions. Also, we should move away after a while from Europe and consider German-Russian, German-Chinese relations, not unimportant either, I believe. Holger Morov.
Yeah, you mentioned that the willingness to compromise is the sense and essence of democracy. Another element of democracy is the interplay of government and opposition. And now, if the Grand Coalition comes to pass, the largest party in parliament will be the AfD. They will be the opposition, Her Majesty's loyal opposition, as it would be called in the United Kingdom. And they will share important committees, for instance, the one on the budget. How do you think this will play out? Will it parliamentarize? Is this a chance to parliamentarize the AfD, as Konrad Jarausch suggested, a Stresemann moment, or could it play out in a very different way?
Let me get Konrad first, yeah.
Well, of course, we don't quite know it yet. I think this is overdone. You know, you have the Greens, you have a very aggressive Lindner Partei, or it's called FDP, and you have Die Linke. So you really have a kind of jostling on the opposition benches, who can shout loudest. And the personnel, I think, of the AfD is not very impressive. My experience with the Sächsischer Landtag was that the right-wing people in Sachsen, they weren't even around doing parliamentary hearings about the Sachsen Landesanstalt für politische Bildung and the Hannah Arendt Institute that I was part of, and these are organizations that deal with the politics of history, and you would expect that a right-wing party would have a strong presence for something like that, and they don't. I mean, it's a chaos troupe right now, and they have a few people with some experience that know how to game the system, and one would have to see what would happen. But I wouldn't be afraid. There are 3 other opposition parties, and that's strong enough.
Thank you. You think a chaos party?
Just one quick point. Your main concern is really that the Grand Coalition unhinges the natural, what the French use the term alternance. One term for the left, one term for the right, and if they make mistakes, then you vote them out, and the left comes to power, the right comes to power, and that has been working. That's our understanding of a parliamentary system. But I can assure you, we are going to have plenty of opposition with a grand coalition, no doubt.
Inside the coalition.
Yeah, yeah, but more than a good and powerful opposition by particularly a group or a grouping that would be an alternative to the existing power, right, is effective government. That's my feeling, because I think part of the disappointment and dissatisfaction with our current system is exactly that government doesn't deliver, the goods anymore. There's too much bickering here in Washington, and there's too much stalemate in Germany. I think you need, democracies have to deliver security and welfare and all of this. And that's, in my view, is more important. So right now, I'm willing to go back to alternance and a changing of powers and between the center left and the center right. But the emphasis is, and my experience tells me, it's important to keep government centered to some degree. Or if a more radical force, political force, comes to power, then it has to mature, right? I mean, you can look around. I mean, that's what's necessary. That's why we have pluralistic societies. You don't have, unless you're in a total dictatorship, I mean, in North Korea or so. But, you have to have that possibility of changing and of change, implementing change. But first deliver the goods. and then make sure that, you know, forces have an equal chance to come to power.
Well, you could, of course, argue the economy is booming, unemployment is low, that the goods have actually been delivered. But let's not go into that. Ask Gerhard Weinberg here.
Yes, okay.
You can hear.
Oh, Herr Weinberg, yeah.
I may have missed this because my hearing is so bad, but there's an issue which it seems to me very much affected Chancellor Merkel, and that is the demographic one. The issue of the very clear likelihood of Germany's population declining, and the fact that in certain areas of the economy they can't find the workers they need, in part because of demographic change. And I wonder if you'd care to comment on that issue.
Thank you, Dieter.
Of course, Professor Weinberg is such a great authority of German history, and I know exactly where your question is coming from. Demographics are critically important. And whether, you know, they force Merkel out, I'm not so sure. I mean, she is 63. She was able to switch, you know, coming from a more conservative wing of the party to, you know, almost open liberalism, right? The larger issue of demographics is, what do you think our millennials are going to vote for? Are they going to be more liberal? And I see that happening. I have a daughter that's 27, and I tell you, these kids are liberal, and, no doubt. And part of the reason is, and I think that's good, the Soviet Union is gone. Communism is not, you know, the defining issue of politics. That's, you know, past. And the younger generation is, I think, almost equally split between left and right. And if you want to make a point, it's the fact that the right gets more support from the younger generation. Look around. In France, you know, the Front National has a lot of younger people. It's not only old
Why is
ones.
that so?
Well,
part of it is, I have to say, I'm, you know, wartime generation, pro-European to the core and to the heart and everything. And that's missing with these younger kids. They would be open to, you know, a more nationalist message, I'm pretty sure. Inside the CDU, the younger are not very progressive, by the way. Liberal, I mean. They are pretty, you know, conservative and national, more national, I should say, than European. And that's a concern for me. I don't want to see that happen. For me, Europe is the alpha and the omega for Germany.
Thank you very much. Konrad, you want to come in?
yeah, two different sentences. One of them has to do with what actually does happen to the birth rate. And that's not a matter of elections, and the CDU has actually been a drag on some of this because of its own Familienbegriff, its own family-oriented kind of attitude towards women's rights and towards childcare and so on, you know. And I think, you know, the younger generation of your 27-year-old daughter, should she have children and so on, would be very much for state-supported childcare and so on, so that, you know, there is an issue. And the other one is, of course, that in a generational succession, the younger people want to find themselves somewhat against the older ones, you know, and so that they're not all just going to get further left than you, and that some of them then become somewhat more patriotic. You know, the danger is when they go from being proud of being whatever they are, Germans or Dutch or whatever when they then get to a kind of xenophobic Islamophobia and so on. That's the real problem.
But DIETER is not really left, it's just being sensible. Thank you.
When demographics alone, the declining population of Germany, I think, is not such a big factor, my perception. That can change, by the way, and we're, by the way, on the way up in terms of birth rates.
Thank you. Katie Lindner first.
So first of all, thank you so much for coming this evening. It's a real pleasure to have you here, and we're working hard to keep those positive relationships here on campus, and we send our ambassadors to counter that anti-Americanism that you mentioned at the end. I'm looking at you,
Hold your
TAM
hand
students
to the
over there.
microphone.
Oh, sorry, is this better? I'm not used to the game show host. I was saying that we're working really hard to keep that on the here on campus, to fight that anti-Americanism that you were mentioning at the end, and we send our students in this idea of supporting exchange among the young people, because I think that is really critical. Anyway, in terms of the transatlantic relationship, I would like to go back and dig a little deeper in what you said. Merkel said, we can't rely on the Americans the way we used to, which was no surprise after the election. And then when you said in the Koalitionsvertrag that it says to remain transatlantic and become more European, I was hoping you could comment more on what does that mean more specifically in practical terms? How do you see that playing out? Thank you.
Okay, shall I start? Okay.
Can I say, let's try to answer it in a few sentences so we can, and then we can take more people. Yeah.
Right. Short and blunt.
Yeah.
It means more distance of Europe from the United States. Wide open relationship with China, and as I tried to indicate, Russia, and Europe wants to play in that league, and not only rely on the United States. So more distance. That's.
Thank you.
Put it bluntly.
Konrad, do you want to come in?
Well, more distance, but also more equality. Not just following the American leadership, but being a player in their own right. And that then could recalibrate the relationship. But there is still sort of a little bit of post-colonial sort of lingering, from the post-war period and so on, when the United States was clearly the leading power in the world. And that, doesn't work anymore. There's frustration on the American side that it's gone, and there's frustration on the European side that they don't want to be treated like that anymore.
Thank you. DJ.
You ask us to get out of just Germany, but I wonder what the Germans and then the Europeans will really do if President Trump realizes his threat to withdraw from the Iranian deal. What would happen if the U.S. withdraws from the Iranian deal? And
Nuclear deal. Yeah.
how can we survive that?
Well, right now, I'll be quick. Right now, Europeans try indeed to work on, how shall I put it, a kind of amendment to the agreement. And what Trump wants is an extension of the 15-year end mark, right? Because the agreement says after 15 years, Iran is free to become a nuclear power. Let's put it openly. And that will be too difficult to negotiate. I don't think any government, European, Chinese, Russian, so-and-so, will not be able to change that marker. Another thing is on the missile question, that Iran builds missiles, which is not included in the agreement. The agreement talks about nuclear fuel and all that, and that Iran doesn't have access to plutonium and all that to build a nuclear weapon. That and the missile side, I think the Europeans can take on, and maybe we might be successful there, but at the same time, Trump trashes the Iranian leadership. He pulls in the wrong direction because it gives the hardliners in Iran support rather than the people who are willing to cooperate, and that's a tragedy. And I don't understand why he doesn't get that.
Well, thank you for that. That's very helpful. But what, assuming that it doesn't work and that Trump
yes.
pulls the plug, what will the Europeans do?
I think they would seek their own agreement.
And how is that, and how?
Well, I mean, the Europeans want to be safe in terms of a missile threat from Iran. They would talk with them. They would create, a relationship that doesn't only rely on sanctions. Now it's way open, for cooperation. And the Europeans, I think, believe fundamentally that it's better for them to, be in touch with Iran rather than shun and ostracize them, and get, that power to be cooperative, a partner. That's their belief. Are they going to be successful? I can't tell. I mean, don't forget, Iran is an old empire, and old empires never totally die. I mean, some come even back. Look at China.
Don't we know from Brexit? Yes. David Litt, yeah.
Sorry, I couldn't get a better answer.
I had actually a similar question. It was, if you could please comment on the impact on the current German domestic political crisis transition of two events. And if you don't think they will have any impact, I'd like to hear that as well. One would be if the Trump administration successfully provokes the Iranians to withdraw from the agreement. Does that have any impact on the alignment of parties and the thinking of parties in Germany? And the second event would be on March 4th, if the results of the Italian election should show an increase in the Cinque Stelle, the Fratelli d'Italia, the League, and other parties like the AfD.
Thank you for that question on Italy. It is so important. I mean, if I may take that first, March 4th. I would have hoped the center-left would have a chance to come back. Then, with Germany, France, and Italy, you would have a stronger Europe. So, but it could well be that on March 4, Berlusconi is the big winner, and you would have a situation like Austria, right? And then you have all kinds of trouble in Europe, and it will be difficult to contain that trend. And that's what I would see as backsliding, not only in Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe, democratic backsliding. That I think would be the consequence. Now to the first quote, that's the Iranian withdrawal, right? That would push the Europeans closer to the United States, in theory, right? Depending on what the thinking in Iran is, what they want. They could alienate the Europeans easily. I mean, but I don't think it's going to happen, because look at the last eruptions of discontent in Iran, right? That was not foreign policy related. It was economically motivated. The young kids were mad about the lack of economic progress of that country. So I would see that as a very slim chance that Iran by itself says no to the agreement just because they have Trump as a foil, to do that. They're not crazy. They are rational leaders. And they want to take care of their own country and the success, and that would mean more cooperation with Europe, and you don't do that if you cut the agreement from Iran's side. That's not going to happen.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Konrad, would you like to come into the Italian elections, for example?
The Italian elections, I think, what we have is a almost European-wide problem of the center-left. And it plays out in different ways. In Britain, it's been Brexit, that is the backlash has won, and Corbyn doesn't seem to engage the European dimension. You know, in France,
fully, yeah.
not fully, not enough. I mean, in order to undo it. And in
He
France,
wants a soft Brexit. He wants a custom union, and you know, that has consequences.
sure, but I mean, but it doesn't really help the people who are the, you know, because not all of the British want really out. You know, they're enough Europeanized. Britons, they are in some ways the more attractive ones to some of us. You know, and in France, I think the political center collapsed. You know, and compared to that, the German situation, you know, is right now a parliamentary stalemate. You know, and not yet, you know, one in which the parties have gone belly up. You know, and in the Italian situation, you have swings back and forth between the Italian right and a new kind of media populism in one way or another, and a kind of center-left attempt to do progressive changes. But unfortunately, those parties and those governments have not succeeded sufficiently in order to convince their own electorate to do that. And so I think we are in a kind of conundrum that in different places has different ways of showing itself. And I think what really needs to happen is a kind of more fundamental thinking about how to get out of this. It is not just a matter, okay, the Schulz debacle is the Schulz debacle. I mean, their personalities and leadership can cover some things, but there is more structural stuff going on that needs to be rectified.
Thank you very much.
I only disagree on one point. That's France. You said it's a collapse of the center. I would almost say it's the opposite. Macron is the center now, and it came back massively, and it pushed aside, you know, the others, pushed aside the hard left and the hard right. And that's a big question for France. Can the center survive?
Yeah, but it's a FedEx question. Can he deliver?
We come to the end, but we have time for one or two questions. The gentleman right at the back there. Yep.
Just recently, China has made it so that Xi Jinping can serve indefinitely if the Communist Party lets him. Will this have any effect on how Germany or the United States perceives China and how they interact with China?
Yeah. Okay. This young man has a question too.
We can take it.
Okay. Okay. Good. Okay. China. Interesting question. I think what's going to happen is that Trump gave China the greatest opening you can imagine, canceling the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was such a, you know, compared to what's happening now, almost a strike of genius, right? So he backs out of it, gives China an enormous room for maneuver. China goes to the Economic Forum in Davos last year and says, we are for free trade, and we are the champion of the liberal world order. I mean, you know, what else can you do in order to help China? I mean, I don't know. And then he expects, of course, China to help with, you know, North Korea and how to deal with the issue. And first that it's a bloody nose strategy, and then they realize that this is almost inconceivable because you play with the lives of 10, 12 million people right there. So, you know, that's not a way of decently dealing with a crisis and with an issue. So China has now, with its Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, that is the equivalent of, and even more, of the Marshall Plan. Think about it, what's happening. China creates access to Europe and the rest of the world via the landline through Russia and maybe Central Asia to Europe, and then the sea line to Britain and Norway and all that. It's a $1 trillion or more than $1 trillion enterprise to connect the world to China. They have a strategy. They have a global strategy. And we don't have nothing. You know, we begin to tinker with ideas of calling them currency manipulators and all that. That's not a way to deal with China. And the Europeans, more or less, will go their own way. They have their own ways to deal with China. And Germany in particular, I mean, Volkswagen wouldn't be the biggest car dealer and car maker without the Chinese market. I mean, that is so huge and so promising in many ways that Europeans will find their own way to China. And I think first we should talk more, between the United States and Europe about how to deal with China and what to do, because there are issues. Copyrights is one issue, and others.
They do talk, but not very intensively, yes.
But they have a strategy, and we need something more than what we have now, I don't know.
Okay, I take one final question, and then I would ask the two of you to make a few brief concluding statements about a question I will ask you in a minute.
Okay.
Yes, Aidan.
Okay, you talked about housing refugees being an issue in Germany. Do you think affordable housing plays a part in anger towards refugees and Angela Merkel in Germany?
Yeah, what I tried to say is really how central the refugee crisis is for Merkel, for the SPD, for Germany, for Europe. And the worst aspect of it is that it splits Europe into countries like Germany that are willing to accept and help, and others who say, we want to be, imagine, homogeneous countries. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, no, sorry, the Czech Republic, Poland. And that's the wrong way. I mean, that it beats any sense of realism. I mean, our societies are different now, and you can't rely on a concept that builds just on homogeneity. That's not possible anymore. You shouldn't be overwhelmed and attempt too much, and maybe Germany went a little bit too far in its generosity, and it's on the way, by the way, to reduce immigration. And I think we have to make a better distinction between asylum, which is the result of crises in other places of the world, and people in need that need help and have a right to be helped. There's an international treaty on the right to asylum. And Germany, with its history, needs to keep asylum solemn and holy, if you want to.
Actually, my question is, does affordable housing play a part in this anger?
Housing?
Housing.
Affordable.
To live, yeah.
That's the issue on site in communities where you build, barracks basically, but they look nice. They're white.
Let me briefly bring in Konrad, and then I'll ask you a final question.
Well, on the refugees, I think it's a temporal kind of thing that is the crisis of 15-16 and its after effects, and then there's a much more fundamental issue of how to create an immigration process for the European Union in which most countries are willing to buy in. And that is only possible by managing immigration and by restricting immigration to such a degree that the various European countries no longer feel threatened. And whether that can be done or not, nobody knows.
Well, that is, of course, a very controversial answer, which we now unfortunately can't discuss because we are running out of time. But that is certainly a question which needs to be discussed. There will be lots of people who agree with you, but also lots of people who disagree with you. But let me ask you as a final question. If you had just been appointed to be one of Angela Merkel's new advisors in the Chancellery, what would you advise her to do, how to overcome maybe her own crisis and the crisis in Germany, and how to govern for another 10 years? What would you recommend her?
The first thing I would tell her is, don't count on the 10 years. Groom your successors. Make sure that they inherit something and not, wait till the last minute when, the process is out of her hands. and then she has a crisis, and then they would elect new leaders without any influence of hers. And I would say, like Machiavelli, you know, you better make sure that you groom your successors and keep a hand on the selection process.
And look for a cushy job internationally? For Merkel, look for a cushy job somewhere in Europe or at the United Nations?
That was always the speculation that Angela Merkel might end up as head of the Commission. It's not going to happen, and when her time in Germany is over, maybe in what is today 2018, we have elections in 21, right? In December of 2020, I think her time is probably over. Then she has to hand over to a new leader and give him a chance to run in the next elections for leadership as a CDU candidate. And then she should say, thank you, has been a pleasure to serve. I'm going to go to Mecklenburg-Vorpommern.
Time to write my memoirs. Konrad Jarausch, a final statement.
Yeah. First I would say buy a hearing aid. In order, no, I mean to listen to the population and to the parts, you know, which seem to have not been represented and which feel distant and so on. There needs to be a new engagement of the Volksparteien with their own basis. And the Berlin stuff after 12 years has become so removed. And the second point would be get some stuff done. Solve some problems so that people can see that something is going on, that you're not only biding time. Because if that's the case, then, you know, we can meet again in 6 months. And if actually some positive things come out of the Grand Coalition, should it come to be, then she will restabilize her government, and then she will have an easy time to manage a transition. A transition when you are under a lot of pressure and your basis is eroding and so on is very, very difficult, and it is not to be wished either for the country or for Europe.
Thank you very much. Crisis or transition, please let me thank you, Dieter DETTKE and Konrad Jarausch. And thank you very much for coming today. Our next event is on whether or not there was an American empire. Maybe there still is an American empire. That is on April the 3rd, here in this very room. Anthony Hopkins from Cambridge University, is there an American empire? So please come back on the 3rd of April. And thanks for coming tonight. Thank you.